Wow. Can you imagine like doing an entire video, like a blind reaction to a video that you're excited for, finishing it and then realizing that you've had your microphone on mute the entire time? Fortunately, that didn't happen today. Fortunately, my microphone was muted at the start, but I hadn't actually started the video yet. Um, Other than just speaking the sort of intro stuff. Anyway, welcome to my channel. Today we have a video that I'm quite excited about. It's inspired by the Fallen of World War II, that video. This one is by Real Life Lore, and it's called "The Loss of Life Visualized in World War One." Sorry, "The Loss of Life in World War One Visualized." Um, they mentioned in the comments about this being heavily inspired by the Fallen of World War II. Which I'm quite excited about because I really liked how that the first video was presented. So I'm hoping that this has similar a similar kind of way of presenting this information, and I'm quite excited to learn about World War One. I feel like World War One is something that's very like overlooked. Like you don't really learn about it as much as World War Two. So I'm interested to see like what the difference is. And kind of just a little bit more about it, to be honest. I must admit I'm quite ignorant about it, so I'm definitely looking forward to learning. Let's get started.
Video is made possible by Skillshare. Learn anything you
Okay.
want to learn with Skillshare for free for 2 months at skl.sh/reallifelore18. I purposefully released this video on the 9th of November 2018. 2 days from now, on the 11th of November, will mark exactly 100 years since the end of the First World War, one of
Wow,
the
that's a
most
long time.
destructive and violent wars ever fought in human history. While the Second World War and the destruction it caused often overshadow the First World War, I felt like now would be a good time to remember and visualize the enormous loss of life that the Great War caused. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately, as well as deaths and injuries separately. A casualty can be a confusing statistic in war because it means that a soldier has been taken out of action, but not necessarily killed. Each of these models represents 1,000 people who died or went missing, while each of these models represents 1,000 people who were injured, which when combined equal the number of casualties. And we'll begin the counting with the United States. Over 116,000 soldiers died, and another 204,000 were injured fighting against the Germans and Austrians on the Western Front. This amounted to
Wow.
0.17% of the American population at the time becoming a casualty of war. But America only fought for a little over a year between 1917 and 1918. The war had already been going on for over 2.5 years before that. So let's take a look at some of the countries who were fighting from the beginning. The war began when Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia in 1914, and Serbia suffered worse than any other country during the war. 375,000 Serb soldiers lost their
Wow.
lives in the fighting, while another 625,000 civilians died from famine and disease. That amounted to over 22% of the Serbian population.
Straight away, that's horrible. So we can see already like how this is heavily influenced by the Fallen of World War Two. That's crazy. I didn't actually realize how World War One started. That's quite interesting, and the fact that it amounted to 22% of their population. That's just that's just ridiculous, frankly.
Dying during the 4-year-long war. More than 1 out of every 5 people in the country. Serbia was a member of one of the 2 alliances that fought against one another in the war called the Entente, which also included the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Italy, America, and many others,
Oh,
all of whom would suffer terribly. The United Kingdom would send over 815,000 soldiers to
wow.
their graves, like on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in which 19,000 would die in only 24 hours, the bloodiest single day in British history. Over 123,000 British civilians also lost their lives during the war, totaling up to just over 2% of the British population, or about 1 in every 50 people dying. But many more were wounded. 1,675,000 more soldiers, which adds together to 5.77% of the UK population, then becoming casualties of the war.
That again is ridiculous. That's so many people. I'm shocked that maybe my school was different. I'm shocked that I didn't learn about this more in school. Especially considering just the huge impact of it. Like that is just mind blowing.
Subjects of the British Empire like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa also fought in the war and took high casualties. Percentage-wise, New Zealand suffered the worst, losing 3.8% of her population as wartime casualties, while numbers-wise Australia took the hardest hit, losing over 61,000 of her soldiers and suffering another 152,000 wounded, with Canada and India both not too far behind. But the other major Entente powers lost an incredible amount more. The Italians joined the war in 1915, but in 3 years of fighting suffered 555,000 military fatalities, along with 592,000 civilian deaths. Another 947,000 Italian soldiers became wounded.
947,000 soldiers, almost 1 million soldiers. Wow, that's a huge army for starters. Like, wow.
Representing 5.8% of the Italian population becoming casualties, a figure roughly comparable to the UK percentage. But then there's Russia and France, both of whom suffered higher casualties than the entire Serbian population combined during the war. Russia was the first country to come to Serbia's defense during the war and suffered catastrophic losses. 1,977,000 soldiers died fighting against the Central Powers, while another 1,140,000 civilians lost their lives. But Russia suffered vastly higher injuries.
Oh my god.
4,350,000 soldiers were wounded during the fighting, which together represents 2.5% of the Russian population.
I know I keep pausing. That Russia gets hit so hard in both of these wars. Like, I did not expect that for World War One. I thought like, oh my god, I don't even know what to say about that. To be honest, that's a lot of people.
That became casualties. These enormous losses eventually helped contribute to Russia's spiral into revolution and their surrender in the war early into 1917. But percentage-wise, the Allied country that suffered during the war the most, besides Serbia, was France. Most of the Western Front took place in northeastern France and Belgium, and during 4 years of fighting, 1,377,000 French soldiers gave up their lives in defense of their country, along with 340,000 civilian fatalities. This represented a loss of life for 4.3% of the entire French population, but many, many more were wounded. 4,266,000 additional French soldiers were wounded or maimed by the war, representing a total casualty amount similar to Russia's, but from a much smaller population. In total, around 15% of France's population became a casualty during the First World War. A horrible loss of life that wouldn't be fully recovered 20 years later at the start of the Second World War. Other Entente countries in order of wartime casualties include Romania, which also suffered terribly at 10.4% of their population.
Wow, 10.4%. I just want to talk about France actually quickly. They lost so many people, and like so many people were injured. Like that is, I keep saying the same thing. It's like mind blowing to understand. Just well, not just even to attempt to understand how many people that really is. It's really interesting when you take that context of knowing how hard the French were hit, and how many people they lost and how many people were injured, and then going into World War Two, where again they lost so many soldiers and they lost so many people, and ultimately, as we know, as we spoke about in the last video, they ended up surrendering. And I feel like a lot of people don't learn about that context. They only learn about, oh, they surrendered. Why would they surrender? But when you understand the context, like even just understanding the context of World War Two, it's like, okay, they were hit hard before that happened. And then when you find out about World War One, it's like, okay, it just gets it just gets worse. So yeah, wow.
Population becoming casualties, as well as Greece, Belgium, Portugal, Montenegro, and Japan, with only about 1,000 casualties
Oh.
during the entire war. But now let's take a look at the other side, the Central Powers, which were led by Germany. Germany was fighting on two fronts for most of the war and also suffered cataclysmic losses. 2,037,000 of her soldiers died fighting in the west and the east, and 594,000 of her civilians died largely due to starvation caused by the Allied blockade of the country. Another 2.5 million German soldiers were wounded during the course of the war, amounting to 7.8% of Germany's population becoming a casualty. While Germany suffered the highest raw numbers of the Central Powers casualties, she didn't suffer the highest percentage-wise. While Austria-Hungary took less casualties overall, they represented a higher proportion of that empire's population, 10.77%. Over 1.3 million soldiers were killed and another 3.6 million injured, all of which helps to explain why the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself wasn't able to survive the war. But the worst suffering on the Central Powers side occurred inside of the Ottoman Empire, and most of it was self-inflicted. The Ottomans joined the war in 1915 and suffered 548,000 military fatalities, and another 582,000 wounded fighting against mostly the British, French, and the Russians. But absurdly high civilian deaths inside of the Ottoman Empire were largely due to the Ottoman government's policy of ethnic cleansing against her Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian ethnic minorities. Collectively known as the Armenian Genocide, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottoman government during and shortly after the war, along with 600,000 Greeks and 225,000 Assyrians. Accounting for all of this in addition to the military casualties, an enormous 17% of the Ottoman Empire's population was killed or wounded during the conflict, which can also help to explain why this empire too didn't survive long after the war was over. And finally, Bulgaria was another member of this alliance that suffered greatly as well, with 6.8% of their population becoming casualty victims of the Great War. In total, and across all countries, about 9 million soldiers lost their lives, as well as 7 million civilians. 36% of all deaths were Entente military, 22% were the Central Powers military, another 22% were Central Powers civilians, and the final 20% were Entente civilians. The First World War was, and still remains, the bloodiest war ever fought in the history of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Second World War was actually not as bad for all of these mentioned countries, but it
Isn't it like so sad that almost the same amount, only slightly less, but effectively the same amount of civilians were killed as the number of soldiers? It's like for every soldier that's killed, a civilian's killed as well, which is like that's
would be worse
yeah.
for others like Russia and Germany. Hopefully, after two terrible lessons during the 20th century, humanity will never forget what can happen when we let our differences get the better of us. Lessons of any kind are valuable for both societies and for individuals, and if you made it all the way through this video to here, it's clear that you enjoy learning, so why not learn even more about anything you want to by going over to Skillshare next. One of the most common questions that I get asked all the time is how I got started making these videos, and the first step was learning the required skills like researching, writing, audio recording.
Okay, we're gonna end that there. It looks like that's the end of it anyway. Just a Skillshare promotion. I want to learn more about World War One. I think I might look up some other videos around it. Unless anyone has any suggestions, that'd be really nice. I think it's like I said before, it's really sad how it's like one for one between soldier and civilian almost. Um, in a war that started between two countries. I'm shocked at kind of the loss of life in this as well. The percentages. This focuses a lot more on like the percentages of the countries and how much it actually impacted the countries, which is, I think that's a really interesting statistic to understand. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. If there's anything that I've said that was wrong or anything that maybe I misunderstood, please do correct me or please do inform me. It's been really cool actually. Moving away from this video, it's been really nice with the first video I did around the falling of World War II. I spoke about this in my previous video as well because it's doing a lot better than I thought it would. Um, and the comments have been so nice. Like people have been really helpful. Like I'm learning like a bunch of different stuff from people leaving comments on there. And it kind of just adds that extra depth to what the video shows. So definitely, if you haven't seen that video, or even if you have seen it, actually, I'd recommend popping back there. You don't need to watch the video; that's fine. Just have a look at the comments because there's some extra stuff in there that's really interesting to learn about. Okay, I'm gonna end it there. Sorry about all the cuts towards the end there. It wasn't. There's nothing that you really missed. I was kind of just stumbling over my words a little bit. I'm quite tired. I probably should have waited until tomorrow to watch this, but I was quite excited to actually check it out. So I've just cut out any parts where I was stumbling over my words or just silent in thought for a while. But yeah, definitely. If there's any other videos that you want me to check out, please let me know. I'm really interested to see what you guys think about this. Doesn't necessarily have to be war related or even military related. They can be if you want them to be. But if there's any general videos that you want me to check out, please let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think. Anyway, if you got this far, thank you very much for sticking with me, and I will see you in the next video. Wait, I can't say that at the end. That's Jacksepticeye's ending. That's just, you can't do that. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.